Hello and welcome to another video review. This is 13 for PC, PlayStation 2, Xbox, GameCube, and Mac. This is a first-person shooter by Ubisoft Paris that was released in November of 2003 to a fairly mixed reception. A lot of people liked it, some others didn't, and when I get more into the gameplay and such, you're going to see more of why that is. But that said, this game is interesting for a variety of reasons. First of them being what you're noticing almost immediately. It's done in the style of a comic book, which means cel-shaded artwork as well as these interesting cutouts that pop up looking like a comic book panel and things like that. And so that sets it apart from pretty much every other game on the market. In fact, I don't think I know any other game that does this kind of thing. Except maybe Max Payne, but it doesn't do the cel-shading thing. It does a graphic novel style thing. And as far as cel-shaded first-person shooters go, I can only think of two off the top of my head, and that's this and Rack. So already it's a very unique art style and everything, and it's actually based on a Belgian graphic novel series of all things, so you don't really hear about Belgium very much either, do you? So the game is definitely unique, but how is it as a game? Well, as far as the presentation goes, like I said, it is very unique. It runs on Unreal Engine 2, but you wouldn't be able to tell that if somebody didn't tell you. It certainly doesn't look like any kind of Unreal Engine 2 game that you've seen, and that's because they went with this very unique art style where everything is cel-shaded, which in itself is very unique in a first-person shooter, but also going a step further than that and really making it look like a comic or a graphic novel. They'll have bits and pieces that pop out on the screen where it looks like comic book panels where it'll show close-ups of action or something like that. Say, for example, you get a headshot, and it'll pop up with a 3-panel comic book style thing where you actually see the person reacting to the headshot and you see this big ARG written on it or something like that. And you'll see all these words that pop up, like people are walking around and it'll go tap, 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 tap. Or they'll have explosions or something like that and it'll go like blammo or something like that. It's pretty unique and very, very charming. So even though the visuals are only about average for what the engine was capable of, the focus on the art style over just the visual clarity actually makes this thing look really good despite its age. So oddly enough, this thing has aged a lot better than a lot of Unreal Engine 2 games, just because they focused on art style over visual clarity. And then there's the sound design, which is kind of all over the place. On the one hand, you have the sound effects, which are mostly very, very solid. And some of them are kind of corny, of course, but by and large, you're having some very beefy sound effects. When you're firing particularly powerful weapons, for example, it sounds like you're firing a particularly powerful weapon. Explosions are very beefy and concussive, and the environmental sounds and everything are also very nice as well. They do a lot to get you into the atmosphere. And then there's the voice acting, which is somewhere between really good and really awful. And by really good, I mean it has the likes of Adam West and David Duchovny in it. And by really awful, I mean it has David Duchovny in it. Because his acting in this is just as bored as you've ever seen him performing. But even then, it kind of lends the game some charm, and none of the actors are particularly compelling in their performances. Instead, they just kind of cheese it up. They know what they're performing in, and they just kind of roll with it. And the end result is something that's actually surprisingly charming, despite not being particularly high quality. And then there's the soundtrack, which is fantastic. You have a lot of these kind of funk and jazz and soul-inspired songs that play in the background when you're doing everything. Lends a very unique musical style to the game. And the soundtrack itself, you can just listen to that all the time whenever you want to get your groove on, and it works really well. So oddly enough, the presentation makes up for its own faults by simply going for the style that they were going for, and it all works very, very well. What obviously really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this is that you play as a guy who wakes up on a beach with amnesia, because of course he does, right? At any rate, he's actually found by a lifeguard and brought back to the first aid station, where the only clue he has to his past, apart from a helicopter flying by and it kind of triggering a memory, is a key to a lockbox in a bank. And so before you really know what's going on, suddenly the first aid station is attacked by hired goons, and the lifeguard is mowed down in front of you, so you now have to escape. And you find out that, later on anyway, you're somebody who is referred to as 13, and you are part of the 20. And these 20 are part of a big conspiracy that I'm not really going to reveal to you. But suffice to say, the plot gets more interesting when you get more into the meat of the game and you actually learn why everybody is trying to kill this guy. So that brings up basically what you're doing the entire game, which is searching for clues about your past, why these people are coming after you, and what is this whole deal with you basically being blamed for this universe's JFK. Now obviously I'm not really going to go farther than that into the plot, because to do that would be to spoil one of the big strengths of the game, which is to say that its plot is actually pretty well done. It keeps you interested with a bunch of twists and turns that just leave you to discovering more and more about this whole conspiracy thing. But there is one really bad thing about it, and that's that it ends on a cliffhanger. And the cliffhanger was never resolved because this game never got a sequel, even though it blatantly sets up one. And so you're left with a plot that doesn't really resolve things, but is still an interesting and fun ride nonetheless. So we already know that apart from the ending, the plot is mostly pretty solid. But how about the gameplay? Well, it is a first-person shooter, like I said, and what that means is you're going to run around and blast a bunch of dudes, and you're going to use a wide arsenal that's available to you. Everything from 9mm pistols all the way up to M60 machine guns, rocket launchers, all sorts of things like that. Each of which has its own uses, its own effective range, and things like that. So there is incentive to actually switch between weapons in given situations. And some of it is just how much ammo you have, because ammo is not exactly plentiful, but if you're a good shot and you're careful with how much ammo you're using, you're never going to really run into problems. But you don't want to just run in guns blazing, missing pretty much every shot, because then you're going to have a bad time. That said, the first-person shooter mechanics themselves are pretty solid. You have, like I said, a pretty wide arsenal, and they each feel like they have weight and power behind them. For example, all the weapons have a pretty significant amount of recoil, so you can't really just sit there and open fire and expect to hit everything like you can with, say, modern military shooters. So you really do have to control your fire when you're going into the more fully automatic stuff in particular. But the higher powered stuff is obviously going to have higher recoil, so you just need to pay attention to that and just make sure your shots are good. Now keep in mind, I played this on GameCube before I played this on PC, and it is way better on PC, where you actually have the precision of the mouse to be able to do things. Not only that, but the frame rate is actually consistent. On GameCube, the frame rate kind of varied wildly. It would go from really, really solid and smooth to just suddenly tanking. And you don't really get that on PC. The most you really get is a problem with more modern hardware, where it'll actually run in slow motion of all things. And the way to fix that is basically to disable VSync, so it's not really that big of a deal. And you may need to do some I tweaking to get this thing to work properly, because on modern hardware it just has issues actually running properly. So instead of having frame rate issues like you do on console, you have to deal with glitches and crashes more than anything else. But by and large, they're fairly easy to fix, and so you don't really have too much of a problem actually running this thing on PC. So definitely the optimal experience for that. And precision plays a pretty big part of this game, because you can actually shoot unarmored parts of the enemy's body and it will actually do more damage because they don't have armor to go through. For example, say you run into a guy who has a big vest on but no helmet. Well, you can shoot him in the head and it will just be basically a normal headshot. Or maybe a guy is wearing a helmet but not torso armor, so you shoot him in the torso instead of the head and you'll do more damage. Eventually you basically knock off the enemy's armor and then you can actually do proper damage to them, but it's much more economical to just go straight for whatever part of the body is not armored in this game. And that extends over to the multiplayer as well, which I'll get to in a moment. But apart from the precision-based first-person shooter mechanics, which very obviously don't work as well on a console, you have some stealth mechanics to go through, where you can sneak up behind an enemy and knock them out with, say, a chair or something like that, or you can just pick up like a chair or an ashtray or any number of things that you can actually knock enemies out with. And it's basically a single-use item where you just run up to the guy, you smack him in the face with it, they fall over knocked out, and then you can just be on your merry way. And that's considered a non-lethal takedown as well. And there are some levels where you're not supposed to kill certain people. And so it actually emphasizes, hey, don't just go running and gunning and blowing everybody away all the time. You need to actually pay attention to what you're doing, plan things out, and work accordingly. And the stealth system itself is decent but not amazing. More often than not, you'll find yourself being detected pretty easily, and part of that is just whether or not you have the patience to actually be extremely slow and methodical. But by and large, you'll find that enemies can just turn around right when you get within takedown range, and that kind of ruins your day. Now, for some items, you can actually throw them for a non-lethal takedown, but you have to get the arc down, and it's actually a fairly difficult process because throwing things is actually pretty slow in this game unless you're using throwing knives. And so a lot of this just takes practice and patience to pull off properly. And what you end up having is a game that really emphasizes that you have basically two ways of going about things. You can sneak around, or you can shoot the living crap out of everything. And it's not necessarily a good idea to go shooting the living crap out of everything because you'll get a lot of enemies coming down on you all at once. And that's not necessarily a good thing because you're not particularly resistant to damage. And of course, this being a kind of old school game, you actually have to find health kits, and you actually have to use them by selecting them in your inventory and then using them as you would any other item in order to actually regain health. And so there's a very limited number of these health kits around the environments, and you'll need to be very, very careful with how you use them. So it behooves you to actually be careful with how you play the game, instead of just running in guns blazing like you would in pretty much any current FPS. And so right about now, the stealth sounds pretty attractive, right? Well, it's a bit of a mess. Like I mentioned before, you do have that problem where enemies will just turn around on you very easily. But other times you'll be able to sneak up on them without much of a problem, and it just seems like a crapshoot as to whether that's going to happen or not. And sometimes you just get lucky and they don't turn around, whereas other times you just get really unlucky and they turn around before their scripted turnaround sequence has even arrived for, say, they're patrolling or something. And that gets pretty annoying. But even then, the thing that makes stealth more of a chore than anything else is how it actually relays to you information that you need to be able to sneak around. You see, in some games you'll have lighting, in some games you'll have sound effects. In 13, they give you the tap text to denote footsteps, which you can only see when you have this small icon in the bottom left of your HUD. And that's basically when you're either standing still, or you're crouched and moving, or you're just walking very, very slowly. And so you only get this faint indicator, and you're not entirely sure if they're in the next hallway, if they're in a hallway further down, because it can mess up sometimes and show way farther away than it should be. And it's ultimately not all that helpful, so sometimes you actually do have to kind of run in and hope for the best, or you just run in and try to memorize the layout a bit so you actually know where the guy is before retrying it as a stealth segment. Even worse, it runs on a checkpoint system, so some of these checkpoints are pretty few and far between, and you might have to restart very large swaths of the game. So that gets pretty irritating. None of this is a wild deal breaker, and they also throw in multiplayer on top of that, so you actually have some replayability there. And what you find there is that on console you can do split screen and even bot matches with split screen, and on PC you don't get split screen, but you do get online play, which is just better. And you can actually do bot matches there as well, but you can only have up to a few bots, and they're not very good. As you'll be seeing in the gameplay footage I'm showing you, they're really not that hard to bring down, and mostly if you go down it's because they got lucky. And so that's even when they're on hard setting. But it does add some replayability, and it can be pretty fun at times, although you'll find that it wears thin fairly quickly because there's not all that many modes available, and the weakness of the bots really doesn't help you out very much. And so you'll find that without actually having servers available anymore, you're not going to find much replayability in the multiplayer, except maybe just running a few bot matches here and there if you just get bored. And it's good for some quick fun. It's mostly fast-paced because most of the maps are very, very small and cramped, so you'll run into enemies very quickly, and it really does feel like kind of an old-school deathmatch experience with the 13 twist on it. And so it's not amazing, but if you wanted a decent multiplayer, you could do much, much worse than this. So all in all, 13 is a very interesting and very unique first-person shooter that blends stealth mechanics that aren't exactly the best with some first-person shooting mechanics that are pretty solid. And what you end up with is a very solid first-person shooter that, despite its problems, is still very fun to play, although it's not for everyone. It's certainly not without its problems, and it's actually not so easy to find it anymore. GOG did have it for a while, but then Ubisoft lost the license to it, and so they had to remove it from their catalog. So I don't really know where you can get this thing easily, but if you can find a copy, it's well worth checking out. I give it a 3.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.